Thanks all for coming. I know this is a fairly restricted take on narrative because it's specifically narrative approach to translation, and translation is not necessarily the subject of the research of many of you. I know I only recognize 2 people from translation studies, so I'd be interested to know whether you are working on translation or not. But anyway, there are, I suppose it's fair to say, you probably already know this, that there are many different takes on narrative. Narrative is one of those central concepts in the humanities where you will get different definitions of the concept in not only in different disciplines, but even among different scholars within the same discipline. So even in the social sciences, even in history, for instance, you'll find different historians with different definitions of narrative. What I'm going to talk about is a particular take on narrative that I adopted in my own work, and that's how it came into translation studies, essentially through my own work, and it's a relatively recent introduction of the concept. And I'm going to start by making a distinction, just to make things a little bit easier, between 2 notions of narrative. One is the very concrete narrative. The very concrete concept. What is a narrative? If you're going to analyze something called narrative, what is it? That concrete element called narrative. And the other, more theoretical, abstract notion of narrative as a take on the world, if you like. What do we mean by narrative theoretically as an abstract concept? And I'll try and give you examples as we go along. So in terms of a very concrete take on narrative, essentially, and this is one of its attractions to me, a narrative is a very concrete thing. It's a story. It's a story that is temporally embedded, so it's always told in a particular place and a particular time. So it unfolds in time and space. Space should be there as well. And it always has a perceived beginning and a projected end. You will notice that with the narrative approach, and this is a theoretical issue that you need to be alert to, with this particular take on narrative, there is no discussion of what is, because we don't know what is. There's only perceived things and projected things and constructed things, because this approach assumes that you have no unmediated access to reality, whatever reality is. If it exists, we still don't have unmediated access to it. So we talk about perceived beginnings, perceived ends, and the narrative is a story in the sense that you will be familiar with, the kinds of stories that we tell each other on a day-to-day basis and tell ourselves as well about what's happening to us in the world in which we live. It's a story that has protagonists, so it has participants, and these participants are not necessarily human. If you think about the story of climate change, for instance, the ozone layer is a protagonist in that story. It's not necessarily human, not necessarily even animate. But all the protagonists in a story, all the participants in a story have configured relationships. The way the story is told, and that's the important thing, is not whether it's real or not, but the way it's told configures a set of relationships among the participants in the story and between them and the unfolding story. So these protagonists are not kind of abstract characters. They are embedded in a storyline, and they are in a configured relationship with each other and the unfolding story. Very importantly for us in translation studies, because we have a long history of thinking of translation only as either written text or spoken text in the case of oral interpreting, but always we think of it just in terms of text. Importantly, narratives are realized through many, many different media, not just even, I'll give you an example in a minute, not just even visual media and textual media, but anything can participate in realizing and elaborating a narrative. And that frees translation studies scholars from that very kind of strong commitment to the text as a written artifact or as a recorded oral artifact. And also importantly, it is realized across text and across media, so that, for example, if you take a book like this is a book called Beirut 39, and it's a collection of translations from Arabic into English. And there are various things. They are short stories, they are extracts from novels, they are poetry, and so on. Now, each of these individual texts within this text, because it's a text within a text, and same thing with narratives, there are narratives within narratives, each of these individual texts will elaborate a narrative or a set of narratives, and together all the texts in this book are used to elaborate a particular narrative about the Arab world as a place that is diverse, vibrant, that has many different types of people, not the kind of stuff that you read about when you hear about the war on terror and so on. So the people who put this together are committed to a particular narrative of the Arab world that is elaborated partly in the individual texts and partly across the different texts, and even beyond this book in other projects that they're involved in. So narratives are not just elaborated in single text. You can think of a narrative that is elaborated in a single text as an episode in a larger narrative. And that narrative that people weave together, they weave it together using a variety of sources, which could be other texts, which could be texts of different types. A project, for instance, that is committed to, say, narrating the Arab world as a vibrant, diverse place of people who are just like us, who are not terrorists, and so on. People are committed to elaborating a narrative like this will use a variety of means of elaborating it. And your job as an analyst, if you are interested in tracing that narrative and seeing how it's elaborated, your job as analyst is to piece together the narrative from many different sources. So in a sense, as an analyst, you are also participating in constructing the narrative that you're analyzing. Okay, so that's an important theoretical position. So narratives overlap and they cross textual boundaries and they cross media boundaries. But beyond that, if you look at something like this, again, is another example in which we can see how, as analysts particularly, we trace not just the narrative that is elaborated, but how it's elaborated, and how a narrative approach, one of its advantages is that it frees us from that heavy reliance on just textual material. This is the website of a group of activist translators and interpreters called Babel. I don't know, some of you may have heard of them. So Babel is an activist group that describes themselves as translators and interpreters, and they offer volunteer, unpaid translation and interpreting in the World Social Forum. You all know what the World Social Forum is? Yeah? So they have a website. The website tells a particular story about the group. They narrate themselves in particular ways. If you want to trace how this narrative is elaborated, you can look, of course, at textual material. So this is textual material. It says Babel is made up of activists and so on, united in the task of transforming and opening up the social forums. We work to give voice to peoples of different languages and cultures. We fight for the right of all, including those who don't speak a colonial language, to contribute to the common work, and so on. We allow everyone to express themselves in a language of their choice. So one of the elements in this narrative that they are elaborating is that there is such a thing as a colonial language, obviously English, and that this colonial language is oppressive, and it stops other people from having the opportunity to express themselves in their own languages and so on. This is a very important narrative element in the narratives of many groups like Babel's, because they're not the only ones. A lot of them, like Tlaxcala, narrate the world in such a way that they say that essentially the long colonial history, and particularly languages like English, have led to a situation where people feel obliged to express themselves in English. If they can't express themselves in English, then they don't have an opportunity to contribute to political debates and so on. And their job is to open up opportunities for these people and to fight the oppression of the English language. So this narrative is elaborated textually, but it's also elaborated in other ways. And as an analyst, you have to look at those other ways in order to piece the narrative together. So, for example, you see this banner, which is on all their web pages. This banner, of course, has Babel's name, but also it has the word welcome in lots of languages. Can you see that from where you are? Almost all languages except English. One of the ways in which they elaborate this narrative and their position as protagonists within this narrative as people who are going to fight that oppressive power of English, one of the ways in which they operationalize this narrative and elaborate it is by downgrading the status of English on their website. So in the welcome banner, all the languages, almost all the languages are there except English. You see here these, can you see these abbreviations? These are abbreviations of different languages which provide interface to the site. So if your language is Catalan, you click on this and you get a Catalan interface, and you get all the main documents in Catalan and so on. As you can see, this is great because I clicked on English in order to access it. English is not listed as the first language. Now, if you go to any commercial website, of course, English is always listed first because it is the lingua franca of the world and so on. On this site and similar sites, as part of elaborating this narrative, you get the downgrading of English by sometimes suppressing it altogether, sometimes listing it lower down the list. And as you can see here as well, again, English, can you see where English is? These are all languages you can click on. English is never the first language listed. This particular section, bit of text here, which I won't try to pronounce because I don't speak anything other than English and Arabic, so I won't do it properly. But this bit of text which says what Babel is, it's an international network of translators and interpreters and so on, every time you go to the site, it comes up in a different language. It's unpredictable. You don't know what language it's going to come up with. Very occasionally it comes up in English. But this is also contributing to the narrative that they are trying to elaborate of the world, or at least the world as they would like it to be. It's a world of diversity, of linguistic and cultural diversity, where people who speak different languages have equal opportunities to express themselves, and where you as a visitor to the site have to be constantly exposed to different languages and cultures. So the way in which these narratives are elaborated can be very, very diverse, not just visual and textual, but they can be even things in terms of ordering of elements. The ordering of elements can be privileging a particular narrative of the world, for example. And of course, the categorization of elements, because if you go to other websites that use a lot of translations, you might find some websites that categorize the world into two sections. For example, translations from the West, translations from the East, and the translations are archived under these sections. Now, this is already telling you that these people are narrating the world as made up of two categories, something called the West, something called the East, and these two are separate and very, very different from the kind of narrative that is elaborated here of a diverse, rich, vibrant world in dialogue with each other. Okay? So that's the kind of thing that you need to look at as an analyst if you're going to work with the narrative approach. You don't restrict yourself to textual or even visual material. Moving on to what narrative is as a theoretical concept rather than a concrete element that you're going to analyze, a number of assumptions that are important here is that, unlike in other approaches to narrative, where narrative is thought of as a textual form, a genre, so people will talk, for example, in some studies of social movements, people will talk about narrative as a textual form and a form that is very effective, so they will say that, for instance, you attract more activists to a cause if you use stories, narratives, because these stories allow activists to see themselves as having a particular role in the story. So instead of using political arguments, use stories in order to attract them. That is an approach that distinguishes between a narrative as a textual form and other textual forms like argumentation, for example. Very much at odds with the approach I am adopting here and explaining, because in this approach, narrative is not a genre. It is, as Hayden White says, the shape of knowledge as we first apprehend it, meaning it is our interface with the world. Meaning that as you experience the world, however the world comes to us, you have no way of making sense of what you experience except by fitting it within narrative form. So even if somebody gives you a shopping list and says, would you collect this stuff for me from Tesco's or wherever, your mind naturally embeds this uncoordinated list into some kind of story that you can fit yourself in. I'm going to take this, I'm going to ride in my car and go to Tesco and do this, and then I'm going to deliver it to my friend. It becomes a story, with protagonists, with a timeline, with a projected end, and so on. Importantly, of course, this also means that narrative mediates and therefore constructs reality. It does not represent reality. We don't talk about representation here at all. It constructs reality because the stories that we tell ourselves and other people actually make up our world, and we act on the basis of those stories. So those stories aren't just for entertainment, they actually construct the world for us. And that's where ethics also comes in. Very important issue in translation. It means that the narrative approach also encourages people to think of translation not just as a matter of semantic accuracy, for instance, or a question of quality. What is a good translation? It also encourages people to think of translation as something that has an impact on society. So the decisions that translators make have an impact on the social and political world, because they participate in narrating the world and therefore construct reality. It also means that ultimately, and I'll give you an example of this shortly, ultimately the unit of analysis in translation and in any textual analysis for that matter is the narrative that is being constructed. So we don't get hung up on whether a word means exactly the same as another word just for the sake of it. We look more at how that choice participates in narrating whatever is being narrated from a particular perspective in a particular way, and with what impact. It also means that different narrative accounts are not just different versions of the same story. So you have a set of events, and different people narrate them in different ways, and they construct different relationships among the protagonists and among the storyline itself. These are not all equal versions, because there is conflict always built into these versions, because people are invested, they have a stake in promoting a particular narrative or a particular take on a set of events, and therefore the process of narration is a site of conflict. And this becomes very evident in the case of translation, when you have several translations of the same text, for example, available at the same time, or across time in retranslation when people retranslate a text. But to give you an example of how this works, because translation makes that process of conflict very evident. To give you an example of how this works, in 2004, on the 29th of October 2004, Osama bin Laden, who was then still alive, issued one of those tapes that he used to send to Jazeera, and this was aired on Jazeera and translated by Jazeera. A transcript was provided in English translation, and this translation became the subject of much controversy, and then alternative translations were provided by other institutions. If you remember, October 2004 was the thick of US elections, and the two main contenders were George Bush and John Kerry. The controversy about whether the translation was accurate or not was over one particular word. This is if anybody here has Arabic, you can check the Arabic. This is the relevant bit of the text. This is the Jazeera translation, which is very close to the Arabic. It says, at the end of his speech, he said, bin Laden said, "In conclusion, I tell you in truth that your security is not in the hands of Kerry, nor Bush, nor Al-Qaeda. No." He's talking to the American people here. "Your security is in your own hands, and every state that doesn't play with our security has automatically guaranteed its own security." The controversy was around the word wilaya here, which is translated as state. Now, the same ambiguity actually applies to the English word state as applies to the word wilaya. Wilaya, like state, can mean a state meaning a nation, a country like the United States, or it can mean an electoral region like one of the Rhode Island state, for instance, or New York state. The Middle East Media Research Institute, which is a very neoconservative group that promotes itself as one of the main actors in the war on terror, one of the institutions that helps the American government fight its war on terror, they contested this translation and provided an alternative translation. And this is it: your security is not in the hands of Kerry or Bush or Al-Qaeda. Your security is in your own hands, and any U.S. state, so they added U.S. state because they insisted that wilaya here means electoral region, not a nation. Any U.S. state wilaya And so to show that they know what they're doing, they also added the Arabic word next to it, that does not toy with our security automatically guarantees its own security. The narrative that they were elaborating here, and this is why you don't need to waste a lot of time on semantic accuracy per se. The narrative that they were invested in elaborating here is that Osama bin Laden was threatening American citizens and trying to influence the election process, and trying to tell them that if you vote for Bush, I'm going to attack that particular electoral state, New York State or Rhode Island State or whatever. And this was circulated in all the papers and became the subject of a lot of controversy, and a lot of people then said, we will vote for Bush because who does he think he is telling us who to vote for, and so on. So it became part of the political conflict. But what it shows is that, I mean, this is not the only example. If you look at, on the web, these links you can look at later, one very, very well-known statement that has been repeated a lot in the papers, and now is a good time to revisit it because of the imminent attack on Iran, is that the Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, said at one point in his speech that Israel must be wiped off the map. Now, if you go to these links, you will see that this is the subject of a lot of controversy. In the same way, people will argue over the exact meaning of every word. If you go particularly to this site, you will see the stretch with a lot of Persian gloss and English gloss underneath the Persian explanations, and people will fight over every little shade of meaning in order to promote a particular narrative of what really happened, what they really said, and therefore how they fit into the narrative of the world as we see it today. So translation is always the site of controversy in this way. We have, of course, the same ambiguity in language in general. I mean, you can, if you want to, you can contest the meaning of almost every word and say that it means something else in that context. But translation brings this to the fore because there is no such thing as one-to-one equivalence between languages. That's, goes without saying. Words accrue different meanings in different languages and so on, and therefore the translation becomes the site of contesting different narratives of the world, and that's what's important about it. So very quickly, to leave time for questions, because I was told not to go over half hour or thereabouts. Why do I think a narrative approach to translation is a useful one, particularly at this stage? First of all, because translation studies, and you always have to, as a researcher, you have to situate yourself within your discipline in some way, because you are obviously drawing on the literature and trying to come up with a different or more sophisticated take on things. And in translation studies, the background to this is that there is a traditional preoccupation with equivalence. That's what most people think translation is. You have a source text, you have a target text, you look for places where the word that is used or the stretch that is used is not really equivalent to what is in the original, and that's how you kind of your way into an analysis of something that's going on. There is also an assumption of neutrality on the basis of, on the part of the translators. There's an assumption that translation itself is a neutral operation that merely transfers meaning from one text or event into another, and that the role of the translator is to facilitate communication, nothing else. Now, that kind of approach assumes that there is no conflict, or if there is a conflict, the mediator is not part of it. They stand outside it, which, of course, from a narrative theory perspective is impossible. Even mediators are embedded in what they are mediating. There is no narrative-free position as such. And therefore, from my point of view, these assumptions simply aggravate the natural blind spots that we all have. We all have blind spots. But if you come into a situation with the assumption that you are neutral and that you are only facilitating communication, then you will be totally blind to the impact of what you're doing, and that is dangerous. There's also a preoccupation with binarisms. So people always talk about a translation is either naturalizing or exoticizing. It's domesticating or it's foreignizing. And there's this kind of preoccupation with binarisms, which actually doesn't reflect the complexity of human behavior. Human behavior is, including behavior of translators, is too complex to be reduced to either or. It doesn't work that way. There is traditionally an emphasis on quality rather than ethics. the idea that, well, linguistic quality, essentially, of the text that is being produced, how close it is to the original, how fluent it reads, how smooth it is. But what the narrative approach brings into the picture is also an alertness to the impact of translation on others, and that means that you engage with ethical issues. There's also a tendency to assume that the translator does their work. They are, because it's a professional activity, they sit there, they do their translation, and that's what you're going to study, and they are kind of cut off from everything else that goes on around them. But of course, as we know, in the real world, and very much as part of this theoretical frameworks, narratives are not elaborated by a single person. The translation that is produced gets worked on by other people, it gets packaged in a particular way, presented in a particular way, so you can't isolate the work of the translator from the work of all the other people who are involved in the interaction. Again, the idea of focusing on just one text and its translation means that you become blind to the larger narrative that is being constructed, and that text is only part of. A narrative approach encourages you to look even beyond the individual text that you are studying, and of course to look beyond linguistic analysis. And this is what I think narrative theory brings to the study of translation, as opposed to this recognition of the complexity of human choices. I'm going to use 2 or 3 minutes to give you a concrete example now, and you will see the complexity of that series of choices that translators make. The willingness to engage, of course, with the ethical implications, the impact of what people do, not just assume that they are neutral and not embedded in the interaction itself. A set of conceptual tools. I haven't talked much about that because there isn't time, but I will leave you with some references you can look at later. But all kinds of tools, from typologies of different types of narratives and the way they interact with each other. For instance, how the personal and the public interact, and how the public shapes the personal and vice versa, to things like the features that make up narratives, how narratives are made up from selective appropriation of different elements, because you can't fit everything into the narrative, how the pattern of implotment is put together. All that is available to work with as a set of conceptual tools to do the actual analysis. Linking the individual text, as I already mentioned, to other texts and other events in order to see the bigger picture, the larger narrative that is being constructed. And importantly, an awareness of, this is important for researchers now, not just for professional translators, an awareness that as you analyze any text or set of texts or events that you're going to analyze, the data you're analyzing, you yourself is embedded in a set of narratives, and that colors your view. You are actively actually involved in elaborating a narrative as you do your research. So you have to kind of be reflexive and be alert to your own mediation of the narratives that you're talking about. So very quickly now, a concrete example to leave time for questions. This is a documentary film. What I'm going to show you is an extract, a shot from a documentary film called Janine, Janine, which was circulated in 2002, in April 2002, when shortly after Israel had entered into, and depending, again, it's very difficult to talk about anything without revealing some kind of narrative location, so I will tell it as neutrally as I can. But at a point in time when Israel had reportedly gone into refugee camps, particularly the big refugee camp called Janine in the West Bank, and there were all stories flying around about what it did when it entered the camp, what the soldiers did, and importantly, pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli groups were arguing over whether, the pro-Israeli, the pro-Palestinian groups were saying this was war, this was huge destruction, demolitions. They were describing it as a war. In much of the media and among pro-Israel supporters, it was talked about as an incursion, a small operation to weed out militants and so on. Muhammad Bakri is what is sometimes called Israeli Arab. I don't like the term, but he's a Palestinian Arab with Israeli citizenship, and he's a director, and he went into the camp after the Israelis left it, and he filmed a lot of the destruction, and he talked to different people, young people, old people, and so on. You have all this as part of the documentary to, from his point of view, show what was going on. So, with this in mind, this is one extract from the documentary. What you see is a very old Palestinian man, very old man, and obviously not terribly educated. And he's asked, what happened, what did you see? And he says in Arabic, if you have any Arabic, you can read this. But it literally means, I don't know, by God, our home is no longer a home. The word home is has a lot of resonance in the Palestinian narrative, because their narrative is one of being thrown out of home after home after home after home. So home here for the old man evokes a history, a memory. And be ready for this. This is how it was actually subtitled. Can you see it? What can I say? Not even Vietnam was as bad as this. Now, those with a particular take on translation, who are wedded to linguistic quality and equivalence and so on, raise their arms up in horror and say, what on earth did the subtitlers think they were doing? This is totally wrong. This is not what the man said. From a narrative perspective, you can still talk about ethical implications, but it's not about equivalence. First of all, the narrative approach allows you to make sense of these choices, whether you agree with them or not, to see what it is that the subtitler, and not on his own, obviously he was working with a group, or she was working with a group, what they were trying to say here. This is part of the narrative that they're trying to elaborate through the whole documentary. What they're trying to say to American viewers mainly, because that is the main target, is that the destruction was so bad. This was a war as bad as the war on Vietnam. This was total destruction. This was no small incursion, as was reported in the papers. So Vietnam here, the choice of Vietnam, evokes a whole set of narratives that allows them to promote a particular narrative take on those set of events. Now, of course, ethically then, if you start talking about the impact of these choices, you will realize that this is a very complex situation. There is no straightforward right and wrong. You could say that ethically, the translator is disloyal to the Palestinian man who is being appropriated in order to serve a particular narrative that he's not even aware of. That man is not even educated. He will never see that translation. If he saw it, he wouldn't understand it. He wasn't asked, can we use your words in a different way in order to promote that narrative? So ethically, you could say that this is not very ethical towards the old man. On the other hand, you could say, well, these are people who are trying to do something about a very difficult situation, and from their point of view, this is a horrendous set of events, and they want, in a very quick and effective way, they want to bring the message home to those American viewers that they believe are in a position to change the situation, because just as they managed to put an end to Vietnam before, they could be called upon to intervene and act in order to put an end to this. So it becomes, I'm saying obviously this in a very, very kind of watered down way, because I want to leave some time for questions, but you could begin to see the complexity both of the situation that the translator is embedded in, and the complexity of the choices that are being made, but also as an analyst it is more satisfying because it gives you a wider range of options to pursue, a richer argument to develop in your analysis. It's not just right and wrong, it's something a lot more complex, and it can be seen from many different perspectives, and it's in the nature of narratives that even as you elaborate them, they are no longer your own. They are out in the world, they have a life of their own, other people contribute to them, other people write about them, talk about them, and change them, and therefore even whatever it is they intended to do, already once that is out, it's doing maybe sometimes things that the translators and the director and the whole team may not have even been aware of or wanted to do themselves. So that narrative is a very flexible framework. It's also, for some students, and that depends on your personality, I suppose, it's also for some students it's an unsatisfying concept to work with, precisely because it's so fluid. it has such porous boundaries, you can't nail it down. There is no sense in saying, is something a narrative or not? That is the wrong question to even to start with. So it's not something that calls for tight definitions, for a mechanistic analysis. Nobody can give you a set of things that you're going to look at in order to develop your analysis. You have to be very creative. You have to look at order of languages, whatever it is that people are doing. You have to look at the colors that are used. You have to look at choice of individual words. You have to be open to being very flexible and use whatever elements to back up your analysis that are available to people to elaborate their own narratives as they go through the world. So it's not a mechanistic thing that you're going to take and apply, not a framework that allows itself to be just applied as it is. You have to put a lot of yourself into it, as it were. So that may be the downside for some people. I'm going to leave some time for questions and just say that when you have this is, I think, probably already uploaded to the site, you'll have a list of references that you can follow up if you're interested. But I'll leave some time for questions now. Does that seem about right?
Thank you very much.
22? Yes.